Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you that have logged on, we're just going to give it a couple of more or a minute or so just to have maximum participation based on those who have registered. Thank you. Now, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second session of Tips and Tricks. The feedback from last week's session on dashboard reporting was very positive and very complimentary to our presenter, Niamh Loftus. The notes from last week's session has been circulated, and for anyone who has not received those notes, if you could just send Arlene Gibbs an based on the address on the Zoom invite, and Arlene will follow up with those notes, which is not a problem. Today's session will be focusing on Power Query, which supports how the capturing and processing of data can be automated through Excel using the Power Query tool. It is something that I myself am not very familiar with, so I'm very enthusiastic in terms of the advantages that will give to us in our daily working life in terms of how we use Excel. Again, for your own information, next week's session is on Power BI. Again, another topic that I'm very enthusiastic in terms of learning. Just to note, last week we did any queries or questions through the chat function, and that worked extremely well. Niamh was very much in terms of proactive, in terms of picking up on those queries. So again, if we could use the same format today, that'd be great. And if anybody has a query that's not responded to, or it might just take a little bit more in-depth explanation for Niamh, that question will be followed up and explained to everybody that has registered. So again, just in the interest of time, I'm looking forward to today's session. I think we can all agree from last week that Niamh's deliverance was excellent, and her mode of clarity in terms of explaining the pivot tables and the dashboard reporting was excellent, and was really delivered in a very clear and concise manner. So I just want to acknowledge that to Niamh and to say thank you. So again, if we can hand over there to Niamh. I know she's logged on, and if we can start with today's presentation, Niamh. Thank you so much.
Thanks a million, Marion, and hello everybody. You're very welcome to your second Lunch and Learn. And yes, as Marion said, we're going to explore a feature called Power Query today. So this may be it may be brand new for some of you. Some of you might have dabbled a little with it before, but yeah, it's just to give you an insight into a really useful feature. It always goes down really well on training courses that I deliver, and yeah, hopefully you'll be able to find some use for Power Query. So yeah, questions, as Marion said, pop them into the Q&A box, and I'll keep an eye on that. And as I say, we'll follow up on if questions appear that I don't address during the session, we'll address them through email post session. So yeah, Power Query is the feature for today. So yeah, great to hear the feedback from last week. So no pressure for today then. Yeah, hopefully this will go down equally as well. And I think it will, because it's just a fantastic feature, and it is really a time-saving feature, and we all know how valuable our time is. So if we can let Excel do more work for us and save us some time, then it's definitely something worth exploring. Now, we only have an hour, so obviously with any of these things, we're not going to be able to get into massive detail, but I'm hopeful by the end of the session, you'll have a good idea of how to get started with Power Query, and you'll be confident in knowing how to get up and running. The examples that I'm going to show you, I can send you the files for those post-course. So again, I know this is being recorded, so if you wanted to try out something I did, I'll send you the work files, and you can maybe look back on the webinar and try out something if you thought it was going to be a useful feature for you. But just before we get into the meat of it, and before I go through any examples of it. First of all, just to explain what it is. So again, I know this may be something you've never heard of before. So Excel Power Query, it's a Power Query is a feature that's built into Excel. Now it is in the let me just go to another slide for a quick second. This one here. So depending on the version of Excel that you use, you will find Power Query in different places. Now I am on, we'll say, Excel 365, which is the most recent and up-to-date version of Excel. So I just have listed, I suppose, the screen grabs of the different versions of Excel. So if you're not sure what Excel version you have, let me just show you where you can find that out. So I've just opened up my Excel window here. If you're not sure what version you have, you can go to in Excel, go to the File tab, and usually there's an option then for Account or maybe Help. If you don't see Account, you'll see Help. Now, when I go into Account, I can see there I'm on Microsoft 365, so I know I'm on the most up-to-date recent version. So you may see a version, an older version than that. So you might have Excel 2019, or you might have Excel 2016, or if you have a very old version, you might be back in a 2010 or 2013 version. I would imagine a lot of you are in the 365 version. But regardless of the version, where you will find it, if you're in the new version, you're going to find it. It's a feature in the Data tab. It'll also be in the Data tab in Excel 2016. Now it's in a slightly different place in the Data tab, but it is there. And if you're on, and again, I would imagine there's not going to be many of you who are in this boat, but if you're on an Excel 2010 or 2013 version, Power Query will have to be installed as an add-on. So it doesn't come pre-installed with Excel 2010 or 2013. So I suppose just to lay that out at the outset. So if you're on a relatively new version of Excel, you'll have it, no doubt. It's only those of you who might be on a very old version might have to go looking for it and installing it. And again, I can give you some information on that if you are in that boat. So anyway, why would you bother installing it if you don't have it, or what is it used for? So essentially, it's a tool that you can use to automate the processing of your data. Now, the best way I can always explain this is if I take you through an actual example. But just to kind of premise the example, imagine you're sent a file could be every day, could be every week, could be once a month. But what you find is the data you're sent in that file, it's not in a great format or structure. So you can sometimes find yourself spending quite a lot of time getting the data into the structure you need. So you might do things like delete certain columns you don't want. You may filter out unwanted data. You may have to add calculated columns into that report. You may have to replace bad data that exists in that file. Just tasks, and it's always the same things you're doing. So as I say, if this is a report that you regularly receive, but it's always got these issues in it, and you're spending time fixing those issues, there's an example of potentially where Power Query could do that work for you. So essentially what you would do is you would record or create a query that would apply the steps to the data that would fix it up in the way you're looking for. And once that query is created, the next time you get that file, you'll have your query done, and you'll just run the query on that file, and you get your data in a click, in a refresh, rather than having to every time open it up, make the changes. You're letting Power Query do that work for you. So that's the first example I'm going to go through with you today. And the other example I'm going to show you, and again, there's loads of different ways you can use Power Query. I'm just showing you two sort of possibilities. The other example I'm going to show you, and I might just bring my folder over here for a second. The other example we're going to look at is, you'll see Power Query example 2 here. So the other example I'm going to show you is, imagine you are sent, and in this case here, we've got, say, sales reports. Okay, so these are sales reports that I receive that are Excel based, and I receive one every month. And I want to report out on my sales information on a cumulative basis. So I want to have all the months in one file that I can then maybe build a pivot out of or a dashboard out of, like we saw last week. But the key thing is I'm getting the files sent to me piecemeal, so I get them every month. So what I want to end up with is a master file which has all the sales data in it, so that I end up with one single file, and then, like I say, I can build my reports out of that. So what Power Query could do for you in this situation is Power Query can pull data together from a folder. So these files here, these sales reports, Power Query could combine those for you into a single table of data, which you can then, as I say, build out any reporting from. And the beauty of it then is any subsequent months of data that you receive, you just drop them into this folder, refresh your query, and all of your master file updates, and all of your reporting from that file updates as well. So if you have any pivots or dashboards built on that data, they'll all refresh automatically. So they're the two examples I'm going to show you today. And like I say, there's loads of other things you can do with it, but these are just two I think that go down pretty well and explain pretty well what it does. So they're the two I've just mentioned on this slide here. So example 1 is where we're going to look at transforming, cleaning, or optimizing data that you receive. And example 2, capturing data from multiple files, which, as we say, is a kind of a folder query is what we do with that. And like I say, then once you've got that good data, it can be then used as a source for pivot tables, charts, or other types of analysis that you may want to do. So as I say, I'm going to keep an eye on the questions. I'll send you this PowerPoint. So again, I suppose there's just a few slides which outline the benefits and I suppose the old approach. If you don't have Power Query, how do you do this type of thing? So if you're getting data in a lot and it's not great, obviously manually, you'll have to either manually fix it, or you might use macros, formulas, VBA, stuff like that to get the data into a more suitable structure. Things like that, though, tend to be quite hard to maintain. So if you create macros on a file that's sent and the macro does all the work on it and gives you the output you're looking for, maintaining that can be kind of difficult, especially if other people don't have macro knowledge and they break easy and you can run into problems. So Power Query is just a much easier tool to use. It's very intuitive. You'll see as we go through it, it's a lot of it we just do by clicking buttons. And once we know where those buttons are, it's easy, very easy tool to get our heads around. So this is a traditional approach, I suppose, is very time consuming and can end up breaking very easily. So Power Query is much more efficient and much more accurate. And again, I'm not going to read through all these slides. They're probably more for you to have a look through afterwards. This is a nice slide, though. I suppose it kind of tells the story of what Power Query does. So it's an ETL. ETL stands for extract, transform, and load. And the extraction, you'll see that when we use Power Query, we can extract or pull data in from different places. So the examples I'm going to use today are Excel files, but it can hook in directly to other applications. Not every application. And if you have a situation where Power Query can't talk directly to the source data, you'll generally export the data into Excel files, and then you can Power Query those Excel files. So for example, if you want to build reports out of SAP data or build queries from SAP data, you would export your data out of SAP into those big master files, and then Power Query can pull from those master files and give you the data you're looking for. So again, lots of different sort of possibilities for it. So let's, without further ado, look at an example. And I say that last slide in the presentation, which you will be sent, that does show you where you'll find Power Query. So I'm going to go into Excel now and I'm going to open it up. And the first thing we're going to do is see where the feature is. So I'm just going to go into Excel here and I'm going to go into a blank workbook. And as I mentioned, it's the data tab that we go to find Power Query. Now, you won't actually see the words Power Query mentioned at all, but in the data tab, it's essentially this section here called Get and Transform Data. This is the gateway to Power Query. And you'll see a few buttons in here. You'll see from text CSV, from web, from table or range. The main button, though, is the button called Get Data. So that button gives you a list of sources that you can pull your data from. So you'll see the first source or the first menu is to pull from a file. And in the list of files that it presents you, you'll see Excel workbook is the top one. Then you got text or CSV, got XML, JSON, PDF, or folder. So the two I'm going to be showing you today are the Excel workbook option and the folder option. But it's good to have a look through the others there. You'll see other options and other sources that can be pulled from. So before we attempt a Power Query, I'm going to show you some data that we're going to pull from, and we're going to show you the problems, if you like, that are in that data. And these are the problems that we're going to get Power Query to solve for us. So let me just open up the first example. So again, I can send you on these example files. And the first file we're going to use the Power Query on is this one here called sales data. Now, I don't need to open this file before I create my query. I'm just showing it to you so that we can see what the data looks like and we can see what, as I say, what the problems are with it. Let me just zoom in here a little bit. Right, so this is the data that we have that we'd like to get Power Query to work on. So I'm going to point out the flaws. And again, let's imagine that we get sent this report, maybe every few days, and it's a sales report. So it's each row relates to a sale, and what I want to be able to do is report on this data. So maybe I want to create some pivot tables out of it so I can see my sales by segment or by sales manager or by country or whatever it might be. But the data as it is not in great shape. There's a lot of issues with it, which would prevent me from doing any meaningful analysis on it. And again, the key point about it is I get this report regularly sent to me. So every time I get it, I open it and I start to have to do things to it. Like, for example, the top 3 rows of this report are useless. They do not form any part of my analysis. I don't need them. So I always go in, and the first job I do is I delete those 3 rows at the top. And all they contain is asterisks, a date, and a username. Get rid of them. The other thing I notice in the data is as I scroll through it, there are blank rows interspersed every once in a while. So that's another thing. Blank rows are never a good thing within a range of data that you want to analyze. So again, that's something I always have to go in and do. I always delete those rows. Other issues in it. If we look at the sales manager column, the way this report has been designed and sent to me, the sales manager, so essentially Joe Peters is the sales manager for all of those sales. But again, whatever way the report is being designed, his name only comes out on the first sale. Ideally, I'd want this. I'd want his name on them all so that I can, if I want to do a pivot table, for example, that I'll be effectively able to report on sales manager. As it stands, I can't do that. So again, that's another job I have to do. I have to come in here every time I get it, and I have to fill these names down for each sales manager. What else is wrong with it? Okay, so in the region column, so there's a bit of inconsistency in how the data has been entered here. So you can see that we've got lowercase on some things and capitals on some things. So again, that's not ideal. How could we get Power Query to fix that? Let's see if we can. Another thing I notice, and this is something you can find a lot in reports that you receive, leading space. I don't know if you've ever encountered this. Leading space means when there is space ahead of the entry within a cell. So what you can see is here, it's essentially space characters in front of the word France there. And again, it's probably come down to how the data was entered. It's a big culprit in manually entered Excel files, but sometimes it creeps through from data as well that comes from systems. But again, that's not helpful. Leading space like this means that this version of France differs from this version of France. So if I go and create a pivot table out of the data, I'll get 2 entries for France. So this leading space, we're going to see if Power Query could eliminate that and mean that we will not have to worry about that in our reporting. A few other things. So we're going to get this query we're going to create. It's going to do quite a lot. Now it's unusual yet have data that's this bad, but obviously I'm hamming it up here a bit to give you a tour of loads of different features that Power Query has. A few other things. Yeah, the salesperson and department column on the end. That's ideally should be split into 2 columns. We should have a single column for salesperson and a single column for department. Why? So that if we want to build pivots out of the data, we have a single column that we can reference for salesperson and a single column for department. I don't have that at the moment, meaning I can't report effectively on either of those things. So again, we're going to see if Power Query will sort it. Another thing I see is in the date column, I'm getting an NA sometimes. So again, maybe just the way the data has been pulled together, when a date isn't available, people are putting an NA value in there. Again, it's not going to be helpful when we go to build pivots out of this data. So lots of things potentially we want to sort out with this data. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to close that, and I'm just going to, and you can create a Power Query in a blank workbook like I'm going to do, or in an existing file that you have. So it doesn't really matter where you want to put it. It can be in a new file or an existing file. So we're going to create a query, just to be clear, that's going to pull the data from that sales data file that we've just looked at. The query is going to sort the issues out that we've identified. And once we have that file in place with the query in it, the next time I get another file like that, I can just run the query on it. And I'll show you how to do all of this. But let's first of all create the Power Query. So this is done, like I said to you, through the Data tab, and we're going to go to Get Data from File, and we're going to go for the Excel workbook option, because that's what I want to pull from. It's another Excel file. So that's what I was saying there. If you had data that's exported out of another system, you could pull from the Excel file that generates. So let me go in here and find that folder. So this is this Power Query example 1 folder, and this is the file that we just looked at a minute ago. So let's point to that. So this might be your first time seeing how a Power Query works. And again, some people might have dabbled with it before, but let's just see what we get. So the first thing Power Query will ask is, so you've told it where your file is. Now it wants to know in that file where you want to pull the data from. Now this file it's only got one worksheet in it. So that's the one I'm going to point at, sheet 1. If there were multiple sheets in the file, it would list each sheet individually, and I can pick the sheet I want to pull from. I see a preview of the data coming up here. So that looks like the data we saw a minute ago. And then it's giving me some options down the bottom here. If I hit load, it loads that data straight into the blank workbook behind, exactly as it is. Okay, it doesn't give me the chance to do anything with it. So what you'll always want to go for to get a Power Query is transform data, because that's exactly what we want to do. We want to take that data and apply the transformations to it. So I click transform data. Now Power Query, it's actually opened over on my other screen, so I'm going to pull it over here. So this is Power Query. And as you can see, it's opened it up in a separate window to the main Excel window. So that's one thing to note. And you can't go back to Excel. Do you hear there? It's dinging at me. It won't let me back here while I'm in Power Query. So I'll show you how to come out of Power Query, but it's a thing that you can't use Excel and Power Query both together. When you're in Power Query, you're doing your query. When you finish your query, you generally will be hitting this button called Close and Load to get back to Excel. So let's look at what we get. So Power Query itself, the window is similar to any of the Microsoft windows. You get a ribbon along the top. So some of these buttons and options we're going to explore during this session. We get a preview of the data in the center. And then on the left-hand side, this would be, if you had multiple queries in this workbook, they would be listed here. We only have the one at this point, but that's your kind of query panel. And then on the right-hand side, you get your query settings. So in the query settings, you can name the query there. And as you can see, what you'll see it does is it names the query, whatever the sheet name is that you're pulling from. So you might want to change that to something more meaningful. I'm just going to call my query sales data. And I hit enter, and you can see the name of the query now has changed on the left-hand side. Now, probably the most important part of the Power Query window is this section here called Applied Steps. And what we'll see here is, even though we haven't actually done anything yet, there are some steps in here already. So there's always going to be 2 steps in your Power Query at the outset: the source and navigation. The source is basically when we told Power Query which file to pull from. That's what the source step means, essentially. And you'll notice that in Power Query, you get it's almost like a formula bar. And if I just expand it down a little bit, when I click on the source, do you see that it's essentially like a little bit of code which is behind that step. Now, this is all done by Power Query. You don't have to do anything here. I'm just showing you. So you see that the source is where it looks at the file path and the file that you've pointed at. And the navigation step would be where we told it to pull from sheet 1. So those 2 steps will always be at the start of your Power Queries, already there. Now, beyond those steps, sometimes Power Query looks at your data and tries to help you fix it. So as you can see, what it actually tried to do next here is it tried to do what's called a promote headers. So it's essentially looked at the data and it tried to make the first row the header row. Now, that didn't really help us here because there was nothing in that top row, if you recall. And it also tried to do what's called a change type. Change type basically means setting the type of data on your columns. So i.e., is a column a text column? Is it a number column? Is it a date column? So those 2 steps have been done. And to be honest with you, they haven't really assisted us in any way. So I'm actually going to remove these steps. And you can do that by just hitting the X next to them. So I just get back to having the source and navigation. And now I can start to build up the steps that I want to apply to the data. So the point is, source and navigation, those you will want to keep. Those are the steps that point to the file and the sheet that we want to pull from. Beyond that, then, you just need to check and see if Power Query has done something else. Has that, I suppose, made a difference? Do you want to keep those steps? And if you don't, you can get rid of them. Now I can look at it and I can start to go through the issues and start to fix them. So the first issue I'm going to fix is the 3 rows at the top of the data, which we don't want. So in the Home tab of Power Query, we have a nice button there called Remove Rows, and we'll see an option Remove Top Rows, which is exactly what I want to do. And it'll ask me then how many rows to remove. So I'm going to say 3, I'll hit OK, and those rows have been removed. Now remember, in future files that you'll get this sales data in, they'll always have to have the same number of rows at the top. Do you get me? If your next one comes in with 5 blank rows, that's not consistent. Your data will have to be consistent going forward in order for this query to work. Okay. So that's a step I've added to remove the top rows. And look what has happened on the right-hand side in the applied steps. It's recorded that step. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all the blank rows. So if you recall, we spotted there was lots of blank rows that crept into the data here. So again, let's add a step to get rid of those. So remove rows, remove blank rows. And again, that's through the buttons. So this is what I'm saying to you. It's quite intuitive. Once you know where the buttons are, a lot of the little tasks you'll want to do, you can just click buttons to achieve them. So I've done that, and look now, see how those null rows, now there's nulls in column 1. I'm not on about those, I'm on about the entirely null rows. Those have been removed. And again, I see the step has been added into the query. The next thing I'm going to do is if I look at my data now, the sales manager and the segment and the region and so on, they would really be my headings for my columns. So there is, again, another button we can use to tell it now to put those up to be the headings on the columns. And it's the button called Use First Row as Headers. So watch as I do this, you'll see the headers popping up to the top. So sales manager now, segment, region have been correctly assigned as the headers. So that's what I tried to do, if you remember, at first. But we really weren't ready for that. We had to first of all get rid of the rows that were above those headings, and then we could promote the headings up. Now, when you do a promote headers, you can see that another step has also come in called change type. And I kind of briefly mentioned this a few minutes ago. What this basically does is it assigns a data type to each column. So essentially, there's 3 data types you'll be dealing with generally. You'll have text columns, you'll have numeric columns, and then you more than likely have date columns at times in your data. So that's all that step does. It assigns the data type to each column. So just to call that out, and the reason it just does it automatically for you when you do the promote header step. Now, more to say on that in a little while, but just for the moment, that's just to address what that step is doing. Next, sales manager. This column here is the one we said where we'd like the names to fill for all the sales managers. Again, a really nice little step in Power Query can fix that for us. So we can highlight the column, and this will be in the Transform tab. And we've got a little button called Fill and Down. So fill down, and that now pads out that column with the correct names. So looking a lot better than it did a few minutes ago. The data now is shaping up to be much more suitable for me to, as I say, do my analysis with. But we're not there yet. There's a few other things we're going to fix. The next thing we're going to look at is the region column. So I called out a few things to you here. I was saying that, first of all, the case of the text is a bit all over the place. So sometimes we have capitals, sometimes we have normal case. So to get all those to be consistent, again, we can highlight the column, transform. So again, your transform tab, and this button here called format. This gives you nice options to convert the content of that column to lowercase, uppercase. Capitalize each word is probably the most suitable for this example. And once I do it, you see how all the case of the letters are now consistent. And again, we have the step applied. While we're there, another option in the Format tab, and this is where I was referring to the leading space. So if you want to get rid of any leading or trailing space can also be problematic. Trailing space is where you might have additional space at the end of text entries. So again, that can be done and sorted out through Format, and this button or this option here called trim. So as I click trim, keep an eye on these little bits of space here. You'll see that when we trim them out, they are now gone. So I have no leading or trailing space now within that column. So it's a really good one if that kind of issue haunts you in some of your data sets. Power Query can shift it out. And there is our step. It has trimmed the text in the region column. What else? Now, I know we did say we had another few things to do, but I might just at this point close this query and just show you what we get. Now, the thing about this is you can always go back in. So if you do so many steps and then you want to add more steps to your query, your query is not set in stone. You can always go in and change things if needs be. So looking at the data there, if I want to get that data and put it out into my Excel workbook, close and load. So this button here. So that does those two things. It closes Power Query and it loads the transformed data into the workbook in the background. So let's have a look and see what it does. So there we go. So there is the data, the transformed data, now loaded into the workbook. So as I was saying to you, it's in a table, a dynamic table. So if we had created a pivot table out of this data, our query would be a really good source for that pivot table, because if we change the query and refresh it, the pivot will also update as well. So just kind of thinking ahead, if you pull information out of this data, it will all sort of they'll all talk to each other. The queries will update, the pivots will update, and so on. I also see when I've loaded the data through, I see a panel called Queries and Connections. And there is the query that we just created, sales data. And the thing I was saying to you there is you can go back in so for example, I forgot to, split salesperson and department. I think that was something we called out. So if I want to split that column, I double click my query, I get back into Power Query. So your query can always be amended, changed, added to if there's other things you wanted to do. So let me show you how I could fix that one. So salesperson and department, this column here, the salesperson is followed by a hyphen, as you'll see, and then you get the department name, which is A, B, or C. So if I highlight that column, and again, this is going to be in transform, there's a nice option here to split that column. And this column has a delimiter, which is a hyphen, so I can use the delimiter option. So again, it's select the column, transform, split column by delimiter. Now I will see the hyphen is not given as an option for the delimiter here. So you can use a custom option here, and I can tell it to split at the hyphen. And then you can even get it to split at, if there was multiple hyphens at different parts of or different points, but it doesn't really matter what you do. We've only got the one hyphen here. But the end result, once I do my split column, is I end up with two columns now, one with the salesperson and the other with the department. I'll need to rename those column headings, and I can do that just by double clicking on the heading and typing the new name. And this is department. But yeah, I now have two separate columns for those two pieces of data. And I'm just going to call out one other thing. And again, I've kind of purposely done this so you'll see these are the types of issues you might come across. In the date column here, do you notice how it hasn't applied the date type to that column? It's got an ABC 1, 2, 3. The reason for that is we have NA values within this column. So Power Query, when it did that change type step previously, it wasn't able to figure out what type of data that is in this column because of these NA values. So let me show you how you could sort this out with Power Query. And again, it's just demonstrating the flexibility it has. If I want to, I can replace those NA values. And I can do that through the Home tab. So I can highlight the column. And in the Home tab, I can use this option here called Replace Values. So this is a bit like doing a find replace in Excel. So I can tell it to find NA. And then if you just want a null or empty cell, you can just put the word null in here, or you can replace it with anything you like. Just put that into the replace with box. And what you'll see is when I hit OK here, keep an eye on the NA values. You see they're converted to nulls. Now I can tell Power Query that this is a date column, because you can see it's still not recognizing it. So you can force the data type here by clicking on this little symbol and saying this is a date. So stuff like that can happen And you can use these features in Power Query to solve those issues. I just see a question. Can you put in a query to delete all rows with certain text in the row? To move, so you can remove unwanted data where it sums up particular transactions. Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose maybe the answer to this for you could be just filtering the data. So yeah, you can filter out unwanted information from your data, kind of like you do in Excel, really. Like, let's just say here, for example, there is a region column here, obviously, which lists the countries, I guess, that we report on. And let's just say that my reporting requirement does not include, let's say, Canada or Mexico. So I can filter out that data by just unticking those options within that region column. Again, that will record that step, and those countries will not be loaded into my Excel file in the background. So yes, absolutely, you can filter out unwanted information, kind of in, I suppose, the way you do it in Excel almost. But again, remember, you're recording it as a step in your query. So that has done the filter and eliminated those countries. So again, having added those extra few steps to my query, I can hit close and load, and I'll see my information now in my sheet has updated with those changes. And I'll see if I go into the region column, you see there's no sign of Canada, there's no sign of Mexico, because we have filtered those out in our query. Just to clarify, sometimes people ask me this, the data that you're pulling from, so remember, this is the file that we have created that query from. This file here. So this file is completely unchanged as such by anything we're doing. Remember, your query is pulling the data from that file and transforming it, but the file itself is untouched, unchanged. So, you know, there's no danger of you messing up the raw data here. So that is an example of a Power Query that's updating and transforming a not ideal data set, I suppose, is the point of it. So again, the query, once it's created, will sit in this file. Now, I haven't yet named this file or saved it. So if I want to be able to use this query again, I'll need to save this workbook. So I'm going to do that now. So I'll just call this sales. I'll just call it sales PQ, as in Power Query. And I'm just going to save this out onto my desktop. So that's it done. So as we can see there, that query is there. Now in your data tab, the refresh button is there. So if that file itself changed, so if something was manually added in there and I want that to pick up in my query result, you've got your refresh all button. We saw that last week when we were talking about pivots. Same thing here. If I hit refresh all, look at the query here. See it reloads. I'll just do that again in case you didn't spot it. So when I click refresh data or refresh all, keep an eye on the query. You'll see it reloads that data. And you can see there's 395 rows coming through. Just to make the point, if I change the name on the file here, will that have an impact on my query? Yes. If I try and refresh now, I'm going to get an error. It cannot find the file called sales data, because that is the query. That's what the query is expecting to see here. So just bear that in mind. If you're going to create a query and it's going to pull from a specifically named file, if you change that name on that file, the query will no longer be able to find it. If I put it back to the original name and I refresh again, we can see it's back working again. So just keep that in mind. Now, again, I can't get into all of the gotchas today, but I suppose that's just one thing to bear in mind, your file name. Yeah, I just see a question from Charlotte there, fixing an issue with dates. Charlotte, I might come back to you on that separately, because yeah, there's a little bit of an answer to that, I suppose. So I will come back to you on that, Charlotte, maybe directly after. So Arlene, if you can take a note of that question maybe, and we'll send you an answer, and I can copy everybody on it as well. It might be an issue other people are facing. But as a final wrap up on this particular example, let me just mention what would happen when we get another sales report. So as I say, this data, this query is currently pulling from this file here called sales data. And this one here, I think we'll say was from October, for example. So because we want to show you this, I have a new sales data file, as you can see here, ready. So this file here, if I just open it up, it's the same structure. So it's got exactly the same data structure as the other file has, but it's got different data. We've got probably more information in this one. The previous month was for October. This one is now for November. So I've got extra data now in this report. So how would I get my Power Query now to pull from this file. Now, there are different ways you can do this, and with the time I have, I can't show you every method. But what I could do here is I can take the old one away. So this is my old report, which currently is coming out. There's 395 rows of data in it. So I'm going to just delete that one. Now you can archive it away somewhere, or you can just delete it. Sorry, actually, I must have it open. So I'm going to delete that one. Okay, it's not letting me do it. So I'll just rename it. I'll call this the old one. And I'm going to, and if you think about it, your query is pulling from this folder path, and it's looking for a file called sales data. So if I name the new file, so if we rename this one, I rename this one as sales data, which is my new version of that file. That will be enough for my query to be able to pull from the new one. And let me just go back into my query again. So remember, this is the query we created that is trained to pull from this sales data file. I've archived the old data. I've now got the new file. I've made it have the same name as what the query was expecting. So let's just have a look at the query here as we refresh it. Just takes a moment for this to pop up. So there's the sales data query we created, the 395 rows coming through. Let's try to refresh. Sometimes you'll see a message about a security concern. You just hit OK. Watch the query. It runs again. Yeah, it just takes a minute. And we've got now 430 rows this time. Why have we got more data? Well, we've got a different file now. We've got new information in our sales, our new sales file. But that's the beauty of it. It's able to pull in that new data without us having to do all the transformations manually. It's our query that's running on the new file and giving us our data in a click. And that's the beauty of Power Query. So any future sales data files I receive, I can just drop them into my report location, remove the old ones or archive them, and my Power Query can just then be refreshed to pull the new data. So that's example one, and it's a really good showcase, I suppose, of different things that Power Query is able to do. I think we do have time for the other one. Yeah, we'll squeeze in the second example because I think this is a really good one to show you as well. Example two then, and I sort of explained the principle behind this one earlier, but let me just mention it again. So this next query we're going to create is going to be a folder query, which is going to pull together these reports, these different sales reports into one single query output, which I can then build reporting out of. Sorry, I just see a question, Georgina. Is the sales PQ a new file or is it the query, so to speak? Yeah, so just go back to our sales PQ file here that we saved previously. Yeah, so the sales PQ, Georgina, that's a regular Excel file. And within that file, you have your query. So that's kind of what that means. So so anytime you want to use that query, it is stored in the sales PQ file. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. But yeah, let's go to the second example. So I'm going to do another query now that's going to pull. Sorry, Arlene, I see a question from yourself. What happens if some of the original data has changed when you add the following month? Yeah, well, I suppose that's the thing, Arlene. So if there's new information, new rows of data that have come into your next version of the report, they'll just automatically come through with the Power Query into your finished output of that query. So it'll just pull that new information in. Now, the only thing I will say is the structure of the files will have to be the same every time. So just to go back to that original file for a moment here. So there'll be no issue with new rows of data coming into the feeder file. Okay, so if there's extra rows of information in the next version of this file, that's fine. The only thing that will knock the query out is if you had, I suppose, different column headers here, or if you have a different file name, stuff like that is the query is looking for a file called sales data. So if it can't find that, there's going to be an issue. But in terms of data, if it's just new data, that will automatically come through when you refresh. Things that might trip it up though, as I say, are if your column headings and things like that are vastly different from report to report. Okay, example two. Sales reports. So again, we've about 15 minutes left. Yeah, we should have enough time to run through this one. So this example, again, doing another Power Query here. This one's going to pull from a folder this time. So the last one we did was we created a query that pulled from another Excel file. This one is going to pull from a folder. And the folder, as you can see here, we've got it ready. It's called sales reports. And these are the different sales reports that we want to pull together. So let's look at a couple of them. And the reason I want to show you them is to show you that they have the same structure. And that, again, would be important for your query to work. So if this is the October data on the left, and this is the November data here on the right. So you can see they are the same structure. They've got the same headings: date, category, product and sales, date, category, product and sales. And remember, the goal of this is, so these are all October transactions, these are all November transactions. So the goal of this is to take each of those individual months of data and combine them together into one data set. And that's what your Power Query is going to do for you. But I just wanted to show you them because we got to be clear that the structure of these files must be the same, and the sheet names, or if they sit in a table either, the table names would have to be the same in each file that you want to pull from. So just to mention that. So let's just do the Power Query. Let's see how this would work. So again, I'm just going to start my query in a blank workbook. And again, I haven't named this yet, but maybe I'll do it at this point. So I'll save my workbook here and I'll call it all sales data. And again, this is a workbook that you'll just save somewhere, and then anytime you want to get at that query and update it or refresh it, that's the workbook that you're going to open up. So it's data, get data from file, and this time we're going to go for the from folder option. And the first step in your query, as always, is going to be to point to the folder that you would like to pull from. So I'm going to point it here to my Power Query example 2. And then sales reports. This is the folder that contains those Excel files that we just saw a moment ago. And there are, if we look at it, there's 4 in there at the minute. You got October, November, December, and then January. So back at my Excel file, we've started the query, we've told it it's a folder query, and now it has started the process. So initially, what comes up is a kind of like a bird's eye view of the files in that folder. So there's the 4 files I just showed you. And again, we're getting options down here. So transform data, that's the button you're always going to click on, because that's the one that gets you to Power Query. So here is Power Query. This looks a little different. The last time we did our query, the data was all there kind of straight away. This time though, because it's a folder query, we have to do just a couple of extra jobs. So first of all, I would just look at the data. I'm happy that they're the files I want to combine. And then to combine them together, you'll see a content column at the beginning of your files here. And it has a little button on it called Combine Files. I need to click that button. And I just need to do this once when I'm setting up the query to do that combine action. And then it's just going to ask me, in those files, what do I want to combine? So I'm going to combine the table here of data, which we saw, date, category, product, sales. If you remember, that was the table structure in each of the files. So that's what I'm going to tell it that I want to combine. And then Power Query will go off and do a bit of a jig. And you'll see your cursor starts flashing a little bit and the query starts to create itself. And at the end of that process, we now, if we look, have, if I start scrolling down through this, there was my December data. Now look, see the January data is there, the November data, the October data. Everything has been combined into one output table. And that's the point of a folder query. It is combining separate files into one master table. And remember, you still all have your options in Power Query. So if there's other things you wanted to do with that data, so if the data again had issues or problems, or you want to filter out certain things, or you want to, use any of those, features I showed you previously, they can be applied to your outputted data. I'm just going to hit close and load though on this, just to get this loaded into my workbook. So there's my sales reports. This source name column, it automatically creates a source name column when you do a folder query. So the job of this is just showing you which file the data is coming from. You can always remove that column if it's not required in your reporting. but I'm going to leave it there for this. So there's all my my data, and my dates, as you can see, are spanning the 4 months of data that the 4 files represent or capture. Just to, I suppose, kind of link into stuff that we did last week. So I could create a pivot table, for example, out of that data there. So I can click into my master data and go to insert, pivot table. And for this example, I'm just going to pop the pivot on the existing sheet just so we can see it next to the data. So now from my raw data here, I can pull in the date, for example, and say the sales. I might just do it on a month basis. So my years and months are there. So there's my 2023, the 3 months of that year, and my January 2024. So a little pivot now derived out of this data. But remember, the beauty of it is next month. So we have one ready. So we have a February 24 data set, which is not in that folder at the moment. All we have are those 4 months. But if we drop the February file now into that folder, just check that it's there. So yeah, see, there's 5 months of data in there now. What does that mean back here in my query? Well, your refresh all button is there. So watch as I do that. The pivot, sometimes the pivot doesn't update straight away, but let's just hit refresh all. Actually, maybe keep an eye on this number here, 262. So that's at the moment the volume of data we have. When we refresh now, having added the February, we're gone up to 310. Now the pivot, it doesn't update immediately. You just have to hit refresh again. And now the February data has landed. So how easy that was to get my next month of data in place. Again, the February data must be in the same structure. So the same column structure and the same sheet name and table name and so on. But such a great feature if you do capture data from multiple files. And then as you've seen, any reporting built out of that query is just going to update when your new files are added and refreshed. So your refresh all is really how you're managing that query going forward. When new files come in here, we just open up our workbook with the query in it and refresh it. And again, obviously you could have charts built out of this. So this kind of links into what we showed you last week. So if you have a dashboard that you want to build out of a Power Query data source, that's a really good data source to use because the data is constantly being updated. So if you have any pivots or any pivot charts built out of that data, those are all going to sort of update automatically once our query updates. So that queries and connections panel, I'll just mention a couple of things. If you're going to start maybe dipping your toe into Power Query, just a few pointers. The queries and connections panel appears sometimes automatically and sometimes not automatically. So if it's not there, so if I close it off, the queries and connections panel is important because it shows you if you have any queries in a workbook. So if you don't see that panel, you can get it by clicking on data and queries and connections. And there is the folder query that we created a few minutes ago. If I go back to the other file, our original query we did, again, when you open that file, what I'm getting at is sometimes that panel, even though there is a query in this workbook, sometimes that panel just doesn't come up. So again, to get it back, I would just go into data, hit queries and connections, and the panel returns. So just to mention that, because I know that can be a little bit of a stumbling block if you're trying to try this out and you're not seeing the queries. So data, queries, and connections to be able to get at your Power Queries. And the other thing is, if you've created a query and the data has loaded into your workbook, you want to get back into the query to either look at it or maybe add other steps to it, just double click the query in the panel and you're back into your Power Query editor once more. So the queries themselves, you can always change and modify them as you go along. Or if you just want to go back and see, well, what actually is this query doing to my data? That's where that applied steps comes into play. You can see exactly what's happening when you go to the applied steps. I think I've hit the marks I wanted to hit today on those examples. So those two are two very good ones to get your teeth into if you want to try this out. I will send you those files, like I said, that I have demonstrated those examples on, so you can have a look at them. And it really is about trying it out though, and not being afraid of it. As I said to you, the Power Queries don't change the feeder files in any way. So these files that we pull from, they don't get affected by your Power Query. So you can kind of use this, and I suppose safe in the knowledge you're not going to disturb your raw data. And just one final point on it, like I say, if you're intending on using this feature to capture data out of other systems. You may have to export the data out of those other systems first into other Excel files, which you can then build your queries from. So for the likes of SAP, for example, you might have SAP reports that you could export out, put them in a particular place, and then your queries can pull from those files. Is there a good source of online tutorials you would recommend? Yeah, there is lots of data and lots of stuff online. I might find a couple of good sources, and maybe with the follow-up email, just somebody asked a question on that there about future other tutorials and so on. I might find some links, and I can include those in the materials that you get post-course. I think that's it. Yeah, so there's a lot again in that, and I'm sure a lot of new information there for a lot of you. So I hope it will be beneficial. So Marion, I might hand over to you just for a wrap up.
Yeah, just again, Niamh, thank you so much for your presentation. And I mean, that time just absolutely flew by. And if the participants are anything like me, I think my brain was kind of going into overdrive in terms of how it can use that Power Query function. So I'm very excited at looking at that. Just to say that, again, this is just a taster session for our members, and that the Institute has very detailed courses online that you can register for. So just to say, again, thanks very much for your attendance today. I hope you found it worthwhile. Again, the notes and recording will be issued out to yourselves, and we would hope to see you all next week in terms of looking at the next session in terms of the Power BI. So again, thank you everyone.